What is log? How do you expose for log? How do you color grade log? Is log better or even necessary when it comes to content creation? Now, I'm sure you guys realize when I say log, I'm talking about S-log, V-log, C-log, basically any of the logs on any camera. These are some of the questions I'm going to try and answer in this video because when I first started exploring my camera to a more advanced level, I guess you'd say, it was extremely difficult to find information out there, more specifically on YouTube, about what the advantage was to shooting in log, and on top of that, how to even deal with it in post. Oh, and this video isn't going to specifically talk about log for a specific camera. The information I'm giving you in this video should apply to any camera's log profile. It's time to move into the video. My name's Dustin, your video tour guide. And you know what? Are you guys sick of me saying this every time in the intro? If you are, well, that's too bad because I'm still going to say it every time. But for those of you who are new, don't lose a limb while you watch this video, okay? Don't forget to follow me on Twitch if you want to have a more personal conversation with me and honestly just want to hang out somewhere cool. You can also join the Discord if you like this community. There are links to everything in the description. Before I start, keep in mind I'm trying to keep things pretty simple when I explain this, so if things aren't 100% accurate, I apologize. This video is really to educate someone on log profiles and help them understand the advantages and disadvantages to using log. So the first thing we need to talk about is what the H even is log? Log is a camera's logarithmic gamma. In simple terms, a logarithmic gamma is just a camera's way of storing the brightness information that you record. That's kind of where the term picture profile comes in. There are different picture profiles you can select on a camera, and a different way each of those profiles change the parameters that affect your image's characteristics. The most common parameters you can adjust in a picture profile is contrast, saturation, sharpness, and noise reduction. This won't be the same for each camera, and they may be called different things, or some cameras may have more advanced parameters for adjusting these settings. I'm just giving you the basic information. So for example, you've got D-Cine-like on Panasonic. What D-Cine-like is going to do is reduce the contrast in your image so you can get more details in the highlights and the shadows. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, you'd want to deliver a video, like a final video, in D-Cine-like. Typically, you're still going to do some post-processing or color grading in order to achieve a more desirable contrast in your image. It's the same thing with log. You definitely don't want to deliver a final video in log without doing any post-processing. The difference between D-Cine-like or any picture profile compared to log, though, is that log is a very friendly format for post-processing because log gives you a ton of flexibility in preserving all the details in your image by increasing dynamic range and also giving the flexibility to adjust brightness, color, sharpness, basically everything in post. Now, I don't want you to get this confused though with raw data off the sensor. So for example, red cameras or Blackmagic cameras or even some external recorders can record raw information from the sensor. The only similarity between log and raw is probably the amount of post-processing you need to do in order to get a good-looking image out of your footage. Raw is something we could talk about in another video, but just to understand in this video that log and raw are quite different. Now that we have a basic understanding of log, should you use log, and is it the best out of all the picture profiles? In my opinion, no. Log is not the best. In fact, if you're curious, pretty much most of my videos on this channel are not shot in log. And when I say videos on this channel, I mean the parts where I'm talking to camera, kind of like I am now. My wedding videos, promo videos, as well as the Generations video on my channel, I shot in log. The time or reason you should choose to shoot in log is if you want the most dynamic range and the most flexibility in post to kind of do whatever you want when it comes to color, brightness, sharpness, and noise reduction. Just remember, if you shoot in log, you have to commit to doing the extra work it takes to get your image looking good in post. Whereas if you choose to shoot in a more processed picture profile, like what I do for these videos, I shoot in the standard profile on my A7S III with the creative style set to natural. This way I don't really have to worry about some variables I'm going to talk about a bit later, and honestly, I don't really need to shoot in log when it comes to just me talking to camera. I am going to get a little into my process for color grading log footage later in this video. Fair warning, it's not super complex, nor is it anything exciting, but I am going to show you one of my favorite tools I've discovered if you edit and color grade in Premiere Pro, Final Cut, even DaVinci Resolve. And on top of that, reveal some of my favorite LUTs out there for Vlog and hopefully soon S-Log as well. Anyways, we'll get there, and just so you know, there are tons of different methods of how you can convert your log footage as well, so keep that in mind. That kind of leads me to my next point, is that there are times where log may not be the right choice. For example, if you have to do a quick turnaround on a project, it may be better not to shoot in log. To summarize, there is a time and place for shooting in log. It's just understanding what the advantage is to shooting in log. Let's move on to how to correctly expose or shoot in log. This is where, in my experience, have run into a lot of conflicting information on what is the right way. It was just recently last year where it finally clicked in my head. If you're new to shooting in log, you would think that it's the same for shooting in the standard profile, right? You just balance your image and shoot right in the middle. Not necessarily. Okay, so maybe you're not new to shooting in log and you've heard that you should expose approximately 2 stops brighter than you would on the standard picture profile. That's not necessarily true either. The point I'm trying to make, and I'm going to explain it, is that when you're shooting in log, there isn't really a correct way to expose it. It's just learning, if you expose a certain way, how that'll affect your image and what is the most important to you in your image / the final result of your video. Let's talk first about the one I just mentioned, and that is ETTR. ETTR is just an acronym for exposing to the right. What ETTR means is that you are essentially looking at a histogram and exposing as bright as possible until just right before your highlights clip on the right side of the histogram. You can do this as well with a waveform monitor. The idea is generally the same. You're just not exposing to the right. You are exposing to the top, I guess. Anyways, so what's the advantage to this? In simple terms, when you ETTR, you are raising the black levels or darker tones of the image, since noise is typically most noticeable in the darkest parts of the video, to sit in the less noisy and brighter parts of the image. This is just the way that a logarithmic gamma works, is that it allocates more bits of information into the brighter parts of the image, since that is where most of the detail is, and then the result is you will get less noise in the shadows of your image. You're going to have to lower your levels and balance everything in post, but essentially this is the biggest advantage to exposing to the right. So what's wrong with this? The biggest problem with this is that it gives no consideration to your skin tones. You'll preserve your highlights in every shot, but there are shots where maybe your skin tones are too bright and you're going to have to lower those in order to get your video to cut seamlessly together. Or maybe your skin tones or scene is too dark, and then you're going to have to raise your noisy black level to match better with your entire scene, which then will not only make your black level noisy, but also your midtones. On top of that, you're going to have to do a lot of work to match all your levels in post. You also sacrifice a bit of dynamic range, because when you get into post and bring your highlights back down, you're likely to crush off your blacks and darker tones of the image. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't expose to the right. If you're shooting something in a well-controlled environment and your goal is to have the least noisy image possible, ETTR might be the way to go. But if you're changing to different environments and kind of in a run and gun situation, it might be wise to consider another option. The next way to expose log footage is to expose for middle gray. You've probably heard the term middle gray or gray card or 18% gray. Basically, what a gray card is good for is giving your camera kind of a standard overall brightness level of any scene you point your camera at. It's a standard in the film and photography world, and cameras' auto exposure settings are typically designed to expose to about 18% gray. The best way to expose for middle gray is to use either a waveform monitor or zebras. Now in Vlog, the proper way to expose for middle gray on a waveform monitor is to put your middle gray at 42 IRE. Keep in mind that this can vary a bit by camera. For example, I believe on the A7S III it's about 50 or 52 IRE. I'm not exactly sure, but just keep that in mind that it can vary. The biggest advantage to exposing for middle gray is that it makes it much easier to match shots in post, and it also makes your subject kind of the main focus since you're essentially exposing for skin tones. This can vary with different skin types, like someone who has white skin, you'll have to expose different than someone who has black skin. It also will preserve just a more consistent image overall in the darker tones and the brighter parts of the image. The biggest disadvantage is that you don't always have the luxury of putting a gray card into your scene to expose properly for middle gray. This is where zebras can be quite beneficial if you just don't have the luxury. There are different methods to using zebras. You can set it to roughly 42 or 55 IRE if you're shooting in log, and if you see zebras on your subject's skin, then you can assume that you're exposed for skin tones. This is also where false colors can come in real handy, but you'll probably have to have an external monitor in order to use false colors. On the Panasonic cameras though, you can import a false color LUT and toggle that LUT on and off. Speaking of which, I made a video about some of the LUTs for Vlog, and I mentioned that they only had a Vlog L LUT. I'm gonna put a link in the description to a download for a Vlog false color LUT. I haven't really tested it fully, so it'd be nice if I could get some feedback and let me know if this false color LUT does work. Anyways, moving on. There are limitations with this technique, but it's better than nothing. Back to zebras though, even with ETTR, you can set your IRE level to roughly when your highlights will peak, and when you see zebras in your highlights, you bring your exposure back a little bit. The other big disadvantage to exposing for middle gray is that you could have highlights clip in your scene. So what does this all mean? This is where you as the creator comes into play. Let's say you are exposing for middle gray and you see some highlights that are clipping. This is where you have to make a choice. Is it important for me to maintain middle gray and just accept that sometimes your highlights clip? Or are those clipped highlights more important for my viewer to see and I just deal with the extra noise I'm going to get by underexposing my midtones? Or is it more important for me to have the least amount of noise possible? I'll use the example of shutter speed. There is a general rule out there that you should double your shutter speed based on your frame rate. Unless of course you're shooting at shutter angle, then you would be at 180. So if you shoot at 24 FPS, you should change your shutter to 48 or 50 since most mirrorless cameras don't have 48 typically, just higher end cinema cameras do. But that doesn't mean you have to follow the rule. There may be times where you want to make the creative choice to shoot at a higher shutter speed, or maybe even a lower shutter speed. It's even possible, maybe it's even a technical choice. I used to make videos for a company that provided a video relay service for people who are deaf. As a technical choice, we would shoot at a higher shutter speed because, you know, they use sign language to communicate, and if we shot at a lower shutter speed, there was a lot of motion blur, like in their hands, making it more difficult for people who sign to understand what they were signing. It's the same thing when it comes to shooting in log. There isn't necessarily a wrong or right way. There is general rules or techniques, but it's really up to you to choose depending on what your goal is. All right, so how do I color grade log footage? I may make another entirely separate video on this, but I'll at least tell you what I do. I use LUTs. That's all I got for this video. Thanks for watching. I'm totally kidding. I'm kidding. Although that is true, I do use LUTs. More specifically, when I'm shooting with the S1H in Vlog, I use the 55 media LUTs that were created by Dennis. A while back in some of my older videos, I tried to create some LUTs for Vlog, but once I discovered Dennis's LUTs, I realized that he was much smarter than me when it came to color grading, and I just abandoned my efforts, bought his LUTs, and I've been a fan ever since. Right now he has LUTs for Vlog and HLG on the Panasonic S-Series cameras and the Blackmagic 4K and 6K cameras, but he is also working on support for the Blackmagic 12K, which is included with this LUT package. Just keep in mind the Panasonic S-Series package is separate from the Blackmagic package. He mentioned to me as well that he is going to start working on some LUTs for the Sony a7S III, which I'm stoked for. Let me tell you something too about Dennis's LUTs. He is constantly providing updates to all of them. If he finds a problem with one of his LUTs, he fixes it and gives an update for free. Typically with LUTs I've purchased, you buy it, and if the LUT sucks, well, you're kind of stuck. But his are seriously fantastic. Back to how I color grade, there are plenty of different methods to how you can color grade log footage. You don't have to necessarily use LUTs. For example, you could bring it into DaVinci Resolve, tell it what you are shooting in, and then convert your sequence to Rec 709, because that's, you know, the standard. Or if you're doing HDR, you change it to Rec 2020. I do want to mention one thing though, that not all LUTs are created equal. Let's say you already have some LUTs and you buy these ones, but you ETTR your image. You may not like these LUTs. These LUTs are created with the intent that you're exposing in the middle essentially, so keep that in mind. You could definitely still use these. Typically, if you use LUTs that are designed to work with ETTR, then you probably won't like them, especially if you underexpose your image. Then it'll really underexpose your image and then you have to really bring your levels back up. But again, I highly recommend Dennis's LUTs and you can find a link to them in the description. The other tool that I use to color grade footage when I'm feeling a bit more artistic is something I call CinemaGrade. Now I prefer to color grade in DaVinci Resolve because let's be honest, Premiere is just terrible in my opinion to color grade with. But the problem is that I typically shoot in 10-bit and in the free version of Resolve, you can't import 10-bit footage into Premiere. Sure, I could buy the studio version or shoot in 8-bit, but on top of that, I do my editing in Premiere, and a lot of the time, I want to do something in After Effects. Well, I just don't know how to use Resolve for graphics, and I've used Adobe products for years, so I'm kind of just stuck in there, but that's okay. The tool works for me and I'm happy with it. The reason that I really like CinemaGrade though, is not only does it make your color grading experience much better in Premiere, but you can create looks for your videos in a very simple and non-complex process that you may not be able to do by just slapping a LUT in your footage. It also does work in Final Cut X and Resolve if you're interested. I may even do an entire video on CinemaGrade, but just do some research on the product and see if it's something that you might like. And if you do like it, they have a ton of videos on how to use their products to its full potential, so it honestly isn't really necessary for me to make a video. There is also a link in the description, and just so you guys know, if you use that link, it does support me. This isn't sponsored. I bought CinemaGrade with my own money and just wanted to try and help make your color grading life easier in Premiere, Final Cut, or maybe Resolve is overwhelming, but you edit in Resolve. And anyways, I'd recommend checking out CinemaGrade if you're looking for something. With that, I think that's all I got for this video. If you have questions, leave a comment below, or maybe you have a different way of color grading your log footage, I'd also be interested as well. If you'd like to have a more personal conversation with me, feel free to follow me on Twitch or join the Discord if you like this community. If you like this video as well, be sure to leave it a triple thumbs up. And like I mentioned, if you support what I do, be sure to check out the links in the description, or you can just support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. Until that video though, happy color grading.